What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about the war in heaven was only half the story? That Lucifer didn't fall just because he was proud, but because he disagreed with God himself. Not out of arrogance, but out of a calculated cosmic protest. Imagine a version of this celestial war that wasn't shaped in the cathedrals of Rome or the councils of Europe, but preserved in the mist-shrouded monasteries of East Africa. Passed down not in Latin or Greek, but in Ge'ez, the ancient tongue of Ethiopia. There, deep in the highlands, monks still chant scriptures the West has long forgotten. They hold texts that were banned, erased, or labeled heresy. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Kebra Nagast, the Book of the Glory of Kings. And within those sacred pages lies a version of the war in heaven unlike anything you've ever heard. In this telling, Lucifer, known here as Satinel, doesn't simply rebel for power. He rebels because he cannot accept one divine idea, that a creature of dust and breath, humanity, will one day be exalted above angels. And that was the true spark that lit the first war in heaven. A war fought not only with might, but with vows, defiance, and divine secrets. In the Ethiopian tradition, this isn't just theology, it's a living memory, encoded in prayers, in royal bloodlines, in ancient scrolls locked away from the world. And while the Western world forgot this version of the story, Ethiopia never did. For them, the war in heaven wasn't a metaphor, it was history. And tonight, I'm going to take you inside that forgotten battle. A cosmic drama of loyalty, betrayal, mystery, and prophecy that just might change everything you thought you knew about heaven, earth, and the future of mankind.
Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me this. Do you believe the real war in heaven has been hidden from us on purpose? Let me know your thoughts, because the stories we inherit shape the world we create. And if this kind of forgotten history and spiritual mystery speaks to you, go ahead and hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss the truth they don't want you to find. All right, ready? Let's step into the shadows of the ancient heavens and uncover what was lost.
Long before time began, before the earth spun on its axis, before a single atom of dust ever existed, there was a meeting in heaven. Not a war, not yet, but a revelation. According to ancient Ethiopian tradition, as found in the Kebra Nagast, God gathered the angels and revealed to them something sacred, something shocking, that he would one day create a being, made not of fire or light, but of dust and breath. A creature with weakness, but also with something angels didn't have, the image of God himself. And that creature would be called man. Now, in the West, we're often told that Lucifer, the great archangel of light, fell because of pride. He wanted to be God. He wanted the throne. But in Ethiopia's telling, the story is deeper, more human in a way. The angel they call Satinel wasn't just proud, he was disturbed. Not angry, not jealous at first, but confused. Why he asked. Should a creature of mud and bone, a fragile, dying thing, be given the honor to rule above beings of eternal fire? Why should a being of dust be exalted above me, who is made of fire and light? That's what he said, according to the Ethiopian scrolls. And that's the moment when it began. Not a tantrum, a philosophical rebellion. Satinel didn't want to overthrow heaven. He wanted to challenge the logic of God's design. He couldn't accept that one day humans, frail and fallen as they would be, might sit in judgment over angels, might be loved more, might be chosen. It's haunting, isn't it? Because when you stop and think about it, this wasn't just a rebellion of force. It was a rebellion of belief. It wasn't evil versus good. It was fire, refusing to kneel to clay. And that brings us to something important. Pride isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides in reason, in what feels logical, in what seems right. But true faith, the kind that trusts a divine plan even when it doesn't make sense, requires humility. That was the test. Some angels passed, some didn't. And Satinel, he began to gather those who agreed, not with violence, at least not yet, but with questions, whispers, and cold logic. It was the birth of division in a realm that had once known only unity. And soon, he would take 1/3 of heaven with him. But here's what makes this version so powerful. It paints the war in heaven not as a simplistic fall from grace, but as a tragic refusal to accept humanity's role in the cosmos. It reframes Lucifer's rebellion not as madness, but the first rejection of divine love. A refusal to believe that love could be given to something as breakable as us. And that rejection, it didn't just cause a rift, it tore open the sky. But war hadn't come yet. The swords weren't drawn. Not until someone stood up and said, "No, this is the will of God, and I will defend it." And that someone was Michael. And what he did next changed everything. Coming up next, the archangel who fought not just with a sword, but with divine intention. Stay with me. You're about to see why Michael wasn't just a warrior. He was a protector of destiny. When Satinel rose up in rebellion, he didn't do it with fire at first. He did it with doubt. And in the silence that followed, as heaven held its breath, one angel stepped forward, not to argue, not to persuade, but to stand. His name was Michael. You might have heard that name before, Michael the Archangel, the one who cast Satan down. But in the Ethiopian tradition, Michael is much more than a sword-wielding soldier. He's the enforcer of divine intention, the voice of unwavering loyalty, the guardian of what God meant, even when others questioned it. The name Michael literally means "who is like God." And in the face of Satinel's rebellion, those words became more than a name. They became a challenge. Who is like God? Who dares question the Creator's plan? Michael didn't ask for a debate. He didn't offer counter-arguments or clever logic. He simply stood on trust. Not blind faith, but holy faith. The kind of faith that doesn't need to understand in order to obey. You see, in the Ethiopian view, Michael didn't fight just because rebellion broke out. He fought because love was being rejected. The angels weren't just choosing sides in a political coup. They were choosing between divine communion and cosmic separation, between humility and pride dressed up as reason. Michael saw what was truly at stake. He saw that God's plan to raise humanity from dust to glory wasn't a threat to heaven. It was an invitation. And Satinel's refusal to accept that wasn't just defiance. It was a denial of love itself. Now here's something fascinating. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Michael isn't just remembered as a figure of the past. He's celebrated every year on Mascarum 12, which falls on September 21st. On that day, churches across Ethiopia are filled with chanting, processions, and prayers that honor Michael's defense of divine order. Not because he won a battle, but because he preserved the future. A future where humanity had a place in the heavens. A future where angels could serve, not dominate. A future built not on hierarchy, but on humility. And that brings us to something deeply human. A lesson most of us wrestle with sooner or later. Real strength isn't always loud. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who chooses faith over certainty. Michael didn't need answers. He needed alignment. And that alignment made him unstoppable. Because when you stand with divine purpose, you don't stand alone. And that's exactly what happened next. Michael stood, and heaven roared with him. 1/3 of the angels had chosen Satinel, but the rest, inspired by Michael's courage, held the line. And when the time came, Michael did raise a sword. But it wasn't the weapon that won the war. It was who he was. A defender of the voiceless. A protector of the promise. A servant of something greater than himself. And even today, Ethiopian monks still whisper his name like a shield. Still call on him in times of trial. Because Michael didn't just win a battle. He taught us how to stand when it matters most. And in the chapters that followed, he would face enemies even more dangerous. Not just rebels in heaven, but those who fell to earth. Because not all angels stayed in heaven after the war. Some came down. And what they did next changed the fate of the world. Up next, the forbidden descent of the Watchers and the angels who traded heaven for desire. Keep watching. This next part will shake the very foundation of what you thought angels were. Every great story has a version that gets erased. Every empire has a truth it wants forgotten. And sometimes the most dangerous truths are the ones that tell you who you really are. In the West, when people think of the Bible, they think of 66 books neatly bound, authorized, approved, final. But in Ethiopia, the Bible is different. It holds more. More books, more voices, more mystery, and perhaps more truth. Tucked away in the Ethiopian canon are sacred texts that most of the world has never heard read aloud. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important to be allowed. Texts like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Kebra Nagast, also known as the Glory of Kings. These weren't random additions. They were spiritual pillars, and Ethiopia never let them go. Let's start with the Book of Enoch. This isn't some fringe manuscript. It was once widely known among early Christians, quoted even by the New Testament author Jude. It tells the story of the Watchers, a group of angels who descended to earth and did the one thing heaven had forbidden. They took human wives. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge, sorcery, astrology, weapon-making. And from their union came beings called the Nephilim,
giants who shook the world with their violence. Enoch, the man who walked with God and was taken without tasting death, became their reluctant messenger, sent to warn these angels of judgment. Now, think about that for a moment. Why would this story be erased? Maybe because it tells us too much. Too much about the spiritual forces still at play. Too much about the real reasons the world is the way it is. Too much about the origins of evil. Then there's the Book of Jubilees. It retells the story of Genesis, but through a different lens. It gives timelines, angelic roles, and secret covenants. It speaks of demonic spirits roaming the earth, and how Noah didn't just build an ark. He made a prayerful plea to God to bind the spirits of corruption. And then there's the Kebra Nagast, a book so central to Ethiopian identity that it became the spiritual spine of an empire. It tells of the Queen of Sheba's journey to meet King Solomon, of their union, and of a son named Menelik, who would return to Ethiopia carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, that Ark, the one said to hold the presence of God himself. And in Ethiopia, they believe it never went missing. They believe it's still there, guarded, hidden, alive. Now, pause for a second. Why were these books kept in Ethiopia, but banned or forgotten elsewhere? Why were they declared non-canonical, even though early church fathers knew them? The answer isn't simple, but here's something to consider. When stories give power back to people, when they reveal hidden forces, challenge official history, and remind us of our divine origin, those stories become dangerous to those in power. And Ethiopia chose preservation over approval. For them, these weren't lost books. They were living memory, the other half of the conversation. And in these texts, we begin to see a clearer picture of the war in heaven, not as a single event, but a series of falls and a series of warnings. Warnings we still haven't heard fully. Because not all the angels fell at once. Some didn't rebel out of pride, but out of passion, desire, curiosity, defiance. And their fall wasn't just spiritual, it was physical. They came down, they touched the earth, and what they gave humanity in return was more than knowledge. It was a curse. Next, the forbidden descent of the Watchers, who they were, what they taught, and why their fall may still affect us today. Don't go anywhere. The next chapter takes us deeper into the mystery.
Not all angels fell in the war. Some waited. They didn't stand with Satinel in open rebellion. They didn't challenge God's plan with logic or pride. Instead, they looked down and saw us, saw our beauty, our vulnerability, our freedom, and something inside them stirred. In the Book of Enoch, still treasured in Ethiopia but banned from the Western canon, there's a chilling moment of truth. It tells us that a group of heavenly beings called the Watchers descended to earth during the days before the flood. They were meant to observe, to guide from a distance, to watch and nothing more. But they didn't. They crossed the line. They wanted what they were not meant to have, not power, not a throne, but something far more human, desire. They looked upon the daughters of men and said, "Let us choose wives from among them and bear children." That moment was the second fall, and in many ways it was even more haunting than the first. Because this time the fall wasn't caused by pride, but by passion, longing, love twisted by lust, wisdom corrupted by obsession. Two of their leaders, Semjaza and Azazel, are named in the ancient text. Semjaza was the one who convinced the others, but Azazel, he went further. He taught humans the art of war, how to craft swords and knives, shields and breastplates. He revealed cosmetics, jewelry, how to manipulate appearance. He gave away the secrets of the heavens in exchange for attention on earth. The result? The birth of the Nephilim, giant offspring of angel and human, beings of enormous size and even greater violence. The earth became corrupted, not just in spirit, but in blood. And for the first time, heaven wept over what had been created. Now here's what's truly sobering. The fall of the Watchers teaches us something that hits very close to home. Not every fall comes from open rebellion. Sometimes it comes from overstepping boundaries out of love or curiosity. How many times in our own lives have we justified something wrong because our intention felt pure? I just wanted to help. I only did it because I cared. I thought I could handle it. But intentions don't erase consequences. And the Watchers, despite their wisdom, unleashed a chain reaction they could never undo. In the Book of Jubilees, it says that their actions corrupted human knowledge, that they introduced sorcery, astrology, and forbidden sciences, leading men not toward heaven, but deeper into chaos. These weren't just fallen angels. They were the first influencers of darkness. And that darkness didn't stay in the sky. It spread across kingdoms, cultures, and bloodlines, into temples, into empires, into us. Even today, Ethiopia teaches that the Watchers' legacy continues, not as a myth, but as a shadow behind history. So what does this mean for us? It reminds us that evil isn't always loud. It often begins with quiet compromise, a small shift, a gentle step beyond the line, and that the most dangerous betrayals are the ones that wear the face of desire. But this is not where the story ends, because heaven didn't just let it unfold. Heaven answered, and he sent a new kind of warrior, not an angel, but something greater, a redeemer, a judge, and a warrior king. The one who would not only forgive mankind, but finish what Michael started. Up next, the cross was not just a symbol of sacrifice, it was a weapon. Don't go anywhere. The war that began in heaven would one day be won on earth.
The war didn't stay in heaven. It fell. It seeped through the cracks of the firmament, carried not only by fallen angels, but by the consequences of their choices. And earth became the battlefield. See, in the Ethiopian tradition, the fall of Satinel and the Watchers wasn't just an isolated cosmic drama. It was the beginning of something far more intimate and far more dangerous. A war for the human soul. And that war didn't come with tanks or fire from the sky.
It came through whispers of knowledge, through the passing of secrets that were never meant for us. The Book of Jubilees tells us that these fallen beings didn't just corrupt the heavens, they corrupted humanity's mind. They taught men and women forbidden sciences, sorcery, incantations, the manipulation of energy, warcraft, astrology, divination. They taught us how to bend creation without understanding it, how to reach for power without reverence. They whispered into the ears of kings, whispered into temples, into sacred rites, into the hearts of the proud. And we listened. In time, kingdoms rose, not under God's wisdom, but under the dark blueprint handed down by the fallen. Think of ancient empires obsessed with domination, blood rituals, golden idols. Think of societies that valued knowledge over wisdom, strength over mercy, control over communion. They were reflections of a different kingdom, not of heaven, but of rebellion. And just like that, Earth stopped being just a creation. It became a spiritual battleground. But here's the part we often miss. This wasn't just an external war. It wasn't angel versus demon in the sky. It became internal. It moved into us. That same pride Satinel carried, that same curiosity that drove the watchers down from the heights, it began to echo inside our own hearts. Every act of hatred, every lust for power, every time we trade love for control, that's the war, still raging. But in Ethiopia's view, this wasn't the end of the story, not even close. Because God didn't just let the world unravel. He had a plan, not just to fix what was broken, but to redeem it completely. And this plan wasn't hidden in thunder or fire. It came quietly, humbly, wrapped in skin, born of a woman. Christ wasn't just a teacher, he was the counterstrike. He came to do what Michael had begun, to confront rebellion with truth, to descend into the battlefield himself, and carry the war to the heart of the darkness. Because this wasn't about punishing man, it was about rescuing us from the lies, the legacies, the curses that came from a war we never started, but inherited. Now here's the lesson for us today. Sometimes we feel like we're battling things too big to explain, emotions we can't trace, temptations that seem ancient, familiar, heavy. What if that's not just you? What if you're feeling the ripple of something that started long before you were born? And what if you weren't meant to fight it alone? Because according to Ethiopian tradition, you weren't. That's where the next part of the story leads. A warrior didn't just come to fight. He came to finish the war. And he didn't bring a sword. He brought a cross. P.S. Up next, the cross was never just a symbol of sacrifice. In Ethiopia's vision, it was a divine weapon that crushed rebellion once and for all. Keep going. The most powerful part of the story is still to come.
We often picture the cross as a symbol of suffering, of silence, of sacrifice. And it is all of those things. But in the Ethiopian tradition, the cross is something more. It's a weapon. Not a weapon forged by human hands, but a divine strike against the oldest rebellion the universe has ever known. You see, in Western theology, Christ is often seen as the Lamb, gentle, humble, sacrificed. But in Ethiopia's ancient liturgy, Christ is also the Lion of Judah, a king, a warrior. The cross wasn't just where he died, it was where he conquered. Let's think about that. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, they teach that when Christ was lifted up on the cross, he wasn't just paying for sin,
He was entering the battlefield, the final battlefield. Because remember, this war didn't start on earth. It started in heaven. And the only way to truly end it was to face it at its root. And so Christ descended, first into flesh, then into death itself. But death couldn't hold him, because this wasn't defeat. This was infiltration. In Ethiopian theology, there's a powerful image. Christ on the cross is seen like a warrior breaching the gates of a kingdom under siege. And what was on the other side? Chains, prisoners, ancient accusations. Everything Satanel had whispered, everything the Watchers had twisted, was waiting there. But Christ walked in anyway. The cross, they say, was not just a Roman device of torture. It was the very key that unlocked the gates of death. And when he rose, he didn't just come back to life. He declared victory. That's why in Ethiopian churches, you'll find crosses not only hanging on walls, but held like scepters by priests, lifted in processions, carried in battle-like movements during holy feasts. Because to them, it's not just a remembrance, it's a banner of war, a symbol that says, the rebellion ends here. Now pause and think about that. What if the place where Christ was mocked was actually the throne where he was crowned? What if the blood that fell wasn't the sign of loss, but of liberation? In the Ethiopian tradition, Christ didn't die because he was weak. He died because he was the only one strong enough to take the full weight of the war and carry it and break it. And here's the lesson tucked inside that mystery. Real power doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like surrender. But surrender, when done in truth, can dismantle the strongest systems of darkness. You and I were never meant to fight this war alone. We were meant to walk in the shadow of a victory that's already been won. And that's what the cross really is, a flag planted on a battlefield that says, this ground has already been taken back. That's why in Ethiopia, the story doesn't end at the cross. Because Christ wasn't just cleaning up the past, he was laying a foundation for a new kingdom, one built not on rebellion, but on royalty. And that leads us to one of the most astonishing parts of the Ethiopian story. The kings of Ethiopia, for centuries, didn't just claim political power. They believed their very bloodline was part of this divine resistance. Here's what's coming up next: the kings who guarded heaven's story, and why Ethiopia saw monarchy not as domination, but as spiritual inheritance. Stay with me. The war in heaven didn't just echo through angels. It flowed through thrones.
We often think of kings as conquerors, men who wear crowns, give commands, and hold land. But in Ethiopia, the throne meant something entirely different. It wasn't just about power. It was about protection. It was about preserving a divine story, one that began not on earth, but in heaven itself. According to the Ethiopian tradition, the kings of old didn't rule apart from God's plan. They saw themselves as living extensions of it. They weren't just kings, they were keepers. Keepers of the covenant, guardians of the ark, and most of all, descendants of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Yes, that Solomon, the son of David, the same Solomon who built the first temple and housed the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. The story goes that when the Queen of Sheba traveled to visit him, she didn't return alone. She carried within her a child, Menelik, Solomon's son, born of royal blood and destined to continue the sacred line, but not in Israel, in Ethiopia. And when Menelik came of age, he made his way to Jerusalem, And according to the Kebra Nagast, the sacred book of Ethiopian kings, he didn't come back empty-handed. He returned to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, that Ark, the one said to carry the presence of God, the one placed in the Holy of Holies, the one that went before Israel in battle, the one no man could touch without facing death. In Western tradition, its fate is a mystery, lost, forgotten. But in Ethiopia, it's not lost. They believe it still rests in the ancient city of Axum, guarded by monks, unseen by the world, but pulsing with the same holy fire it carried in the days of Moses. And that belief, it shaped a kingdom. Because if the ark was truly there, if God's presence had moved to the mountains of East Africa, then the throne of Ethiopia wasn't just a political seat, it was a spiritual stronghold. Ethiopian emperors weren't merely governing a nation, they were standing against the fallout of a war that began in heaven, a war that tried to sever humanity from its divine calling. By claiming lineage from Solomon and Sheba, they weren't boasting of noble blood, they were affirming their responsibility to defend the legacy of the righteous, to keep the truth alive when the rest of the world forgot, to rule not with iron, but with scrolls, prayer, and an awareness that their reign was never about them. It was about Him. And here's something worth reflecting on. What if true leadership isn't about commanding armies or collecting gold? What if it's about carrying a story? What if the real throne isn't a chair, but a burden, a sacred one? Because in Ethiopia, kings bowed before priests, the crown served the cross, and every generation was tasked with the same vow to hold the line between the light and the darkness. That's why for centuries the Solomonic dynasty endured, not just because of strategy or strength, but because their people believed they were part of something eternal. And even after the monarchy fell, the memory didn't. Today, Ethiopian churches still teach of Menelik, still chant the songs of Michael, still revere the Ark not as a legend, but as a living connection to a cosmic truth. Because in their view, the war in heaven wasn't just written in the skies, it was carved into royal blood. And that brings us to the final truth. This version of the war, preserved in Ethiopia, isn't just an alternative theory, it's a parallel cosmology, a complete and powerful reframing of what it means to be human, to be loved, to be chosen.
We often think of ancient stories as things frozen in time, kept behind glass, tucked into dusty scrolls, or buried beneath the weight of forgotten languages. But in Ethiopia, these stories still breathe. They're not just relics, they're rhythms, chanted by monks at dawn beside the waters of Lake Tana, etched into the stone walls of Lalibela, where churches were carved downward into the earth, as if trying to reach heaven from the inside. They're whispered in the margins of illuminated manuscripts and carried in processions where crosses aren't just symbols, but weapons of light. And all of it, every tradition, every ritual, every verse, comes from a cosmology that never stopped living. A world where angels are not statues with marble eyes, but beings with choice, emotion, and consequence. Where rebellion is not cartoonish evil, but a tragic refusal to love. Where humans are not an afterthought of creation, but the very center of God's design. And that's why the Ethiopian version still matters, because in this vision, you matter. Not just as a sinner in need of saving, but as a soul worth fighting for before you were ever born. Think about that. Before there was dust, before there was blood, before your name was ever whispered into existence, the heavens already trembled at your future. Satinel fell because he couldn't accept it.
Michael rose because he chose to defend it. Christ came because he refused to lose it. And now, you're living in the aftermath of a war that heaven already won. That's why this story isn't just theology, it's personal. It tells us that history isn't only written by victors. Sometimes it's guarded by the faithful, by monks who preserved the books others burned, by kings who bowed to something higher than their crown, by voices who kept chanting even when no one else was listening, and maybe by you. Because here's the real question. What if the reason this version survived, hidden in the highlands, protected for centuries, is because it was waiting for someone like you to hear it? What if the war in heaven wasn't just a story of the past, but a mirror for the present? A reminder that we are still part of this cosmic struggle, still choosing between humility and pride, faith and fear, light and shadows. And maybe, this time, you are the one standing in the center. Not to fight alone, but to remember who you really are. A being made of dust and glory. Fragile but chosen. And deeply, dangerously, eternally loved. If this journey stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Comment below, I am part of the story. Let's see how many of us still carry the flame. Like this video if it helped you see something new. Subscribe for mere forgotten truths brought back to light. And share this with someone who's ready to remember who they are. Because some stories were never meant to be lost, only rediscovered. And this one was calling to you all along.